Welcome everyone. I'm Caroline Elliott. I'm the Executive Director of CREA. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Our speaker, Barbara Snapp, is going to start with a few yes or no questions for all of you at the beginning. So be prepared to either raise your hand like this, or you can raise your hand virtually, whichever you're more comfortable with. When the questions are finished, if your audio isn't muted, please do mute it so we don't get any background noise during Barbara's talk. It can also, if you're having issues with the video breaking up or the sound quality, it can be a good idea to turn off both your audio and video. That makes more bandwidth available for the presentation to come to you. So that's just a suggestion. And both the audio and video mute buttons are, I think, on the bottom left of your screen. That's where they are on mine. Barbara's going to pause at a couple of natural breaks in her presentation to answer questions. Because of the number of people that we have on this call, it's probably best to put questions in the chat box. Unless you have, if you have a really long, complicated question that doesn't lend itself well to the chat box, just put something in there that says, I have a question about, and just tell us what the topic is. And we'll ask you to, at some point, to unmute your audio and to ask your question verbally. And then we'll have questions at the end as well. So I just want to give you a peek at our next two programs coming up. This Friday at noon, we have a lunch and learn with Zero Waste Maine on how to reduce waste in your household. Jules Olson of Zero Waste Maine has really a great presentation, and she's got a lot of practical ways to live a little more lightly on the earth, including sort of, she's adapted it for how to deal with COVID when there's even more PPE and gloves and all sorts of stuff, and Lord knows Amazon packages. So anyway, feel free to, if you're interested in that, you can register for that on our website on the events page. For our February program, we have two speakers, Josh Royt of the Nature Conservancy Maine chapter and Landis Hudson of Maine Rivers will be talking about river restoration efforts, both globally and here in Maine. They'll tell us about the incredible human and ecological communities that have built up around migrating fish historically, and bring that forward into the present as they describe some of the efforts underway to restore rivers and their historical fish runs. So that should be really good. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank our CREA members and our programs committee, because they make these, our speaker programs possible. We work really hard to find great speakers on relevant topics and important topics, but it does take time. There's really an amazing amount of talent in the fields of nature and the environment and sustainability in Maine. And a lot of that talent sort of hums along in the background and is known, you know, primarily within their professional communities. And we love to use our speaker programs as an opportunity to bring you those voices, so you get to hear some of the incredible passion and expertise that exists right in our own communities. So if you enjoy these speakers and you aren't a member of CREA, I hope you'll consider joining us. We do a lot with a little, but new memberships are always welcome and a great help to us. Two other notes. We have a new book, The Snowy Day, at our Story Walk, which is at 179 Neptune Drive in Brunswick. Bring your children or grandchildren to read, run, and enjoy that. It's a great book. And our fantastic camp director, Jenny Mueller, is very busy and excited to be planning summer camp. I think CREA's summer camp this year will be probably hands down the best ever, if you believe the saying that absence makes the heart grow fonder. I just can only imagine how excited our campers are going to be to have the opportunity to spend 5 full days each week with their peers outside. we can't wait to give them that experience. And we're pretty sure they can't either, and their parents, probably. Let's see. So off we go to Barbara, Barbara is gonna share her screen, and while or do you want to start your screen now, Barbara?
No, I want to start with everyone to do the questions.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Barbara, and then she'll get started. Barbara Snapp has taught and researched in the field of science for 45 years since receiving her PhD in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Cornell. She's done research on leeches, petrel chicks, barn swallows, hibernating ground squirrels, and my favorite, the feeding behavior of intertidal snails. We have to talk about that sometime, Barbara. I want to learn more about the feeding behavior of intertidal snails. Now retired, Barbara continues to participate scientifically in all sorts of ways. She's on the stewardship committee of the Down East Coastal Conservancy and monitors a Down East preserve for migrating shorebirds. She teaches science-based courses at Mid-Coast Senior College. She's an active citizen scientist participating in Project Feeder Watch and the Great Backyard Bird Count. And since moving to Maine, she has kept logs of species sighted at her home in Brunswick and at her vacation cottage in Steuben. In retirement, she's also taken up painting and poetry, finding that these creative disciplines help her focus on details, key concepts, and ideas in both her teaching and her painting. So given all that Barbara has going on in her life, I think we're incredibly lucky to steal her away for an hour or two to share her knowledge about threats to bird populations and to help us understand how we can better support birds everywhere. So take it away, Barbara.
Okay, welcome everyone. It's awkward for me doing a Zoom because I, throughout my teaching career, have always felt that connection, that visual connection that you have with students is absolutely critical. Even when I was doing things on the overhead projector, I could glance out at the audience and I could tell, are they with me or are they not? So in order to kind of get us to feel a little bit like we're a group together, I'm going to ask a couple of yes or no questions to sort of get us in the mood of this topic. And all you need to do, if it's a yes, is raise your hand. And we'll see how many hands are up. And if the answer is no, don't raise your hand. But these are kind of to get us thinking about birds and the role that birds have in our life. And along the lines of looking for silver linings in clouds, I want to know how many of you have noticed birds more during the pandemic than you did before? Now, a lot of people have. And in fact, this is a phenomenon that has spread across the country. People have all of a sudden discovered, even in the city, there are birds here because they can hear them. The birds themselves, their singing behavior in particular, shifted a little in the absence of the background noise. So there is a silver lining in the pandemic, at least from the standpoint of the birds. So how many of you have bird feeders in your backyard? Okay, a fair number of you. A nice, easy way to keep tabs on the birds without, especially in the winter, having to put on jackets and go out and freeze to death. And among those of you who have bird feeders, are there people here who've had them for more than 20 years, pay attention to them, kind of have a sense of who they expect to see there? So if you've had it for that long and have really been paying attention, how many of those of you are there? Okay, very good. And it's people like you that Project Feeder Watch counts on for data. So if any of you have not heard about Project Feeder Watch and are interested in joining it, I encourage you to find out more about it. So with those few questions and sort of getting us going, I'm about to start off. I want to give a couple of comments first, though. This is a view from the top of Mount Everest of bird diversity. Basically, we're way far out away from looking at the birds in your backyard, even though it's the birds in your backyard that have provided a lot of the data and the information that has gone into the scientific research on birds. So there may be different kinds of density very generally today. And we're going to be looking at a lot of graphs, which is part of the reason I'm going to pause a couple of times for questions. The graphs, look at the colors and look at the size of the circles or the bars. Yes.
Could you share your screen?
Yes, I can share my screen. I don't have anything really for you to look at yet, but that's okay.
Sorry. I thought you were referring to something that we were supposed to be looking at.
No, I don't have anything on the screen at this point, but I may as well go ahead and get started with the first slide. So the slides we're going to look at are the best way to give you an aggregate idea of what's been happening with the total number of birds. And as you can see, this is taken from one of the papers that I relied on in putting this talk together. As you can see, the title says vanishing. More than 1 in 4 birds has disappeared in the last 50 years. And that right there is a pretty shocking statistic. The research that's been going on with regard to birds has been happening with a consortium of groups and researchers that have formed a partnership in protection of birds. They have a website, 3billionbirds.org, and you can go there and play around with their data. They ask questions, you can specialize, you can look at Utah and find out what's going on with birds in Utah if you want to. One of the most important scientific papers that came out with regard to the bird decline came out in Science about 15 months ago, in October of 2019. And the bottom line result was that they found there was a net loss that approached 3 billion birds, or 29% of the total number that the population had been in 1970. This is data that was aggregated from a number of different organizations. I am going to rely on data from that Science paper, but also from the paper produced by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and a website that the Audubon Society maintains, which is primarily focused on the role of climate in impacting the number of birds that we see. So the data you're going to see, the graphs that you're going to see come from these 3 different venues in particular. And I will say I had a very infinitesimally small part in producing the work that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has sponsored, part of which was in that Science article, through participating in Project Feeder Watch. So citizen science is something that the people studying bird population changes really appreciate and rely on. So in the last 40 years, these 5 species, all of which occur in Maine, have lost at least 1 in 4. Blue jays and rose-breasted grosbeaks, 1 in 4 lost. Baltimore orioles, white-throated sparrows, and dark-eyed juncos, 1 in 3 lost. And this is across their entire range in the United States. But we are also seeing declines, maybe not to this extent, but declines in Maine as well. This graph shows you the speed of the decline in a very visual way. Note that the y-axis doesn't go to 0, but it does go from the 100% level, which is going to be our starting point for most of these charts in 1970, and then plummets 30% down to just above 70% remaining as of 2017. So 2.9 billion birds gone in 50 years. The 3 of the birds that have seen losses in Maine are the wood thrush, the white-throated sparrow, and the rusty blackbird. This decline has occurred across almost all habitats. The eastern forests actually showed the smallest decline, and that's 17%. So right there, think 17% is not that far away from 20%, which is 1/5 of the total bird population in the eastern forest has been lost. And then the losses are increasingly greater as we go to the Arctic tundra, the western forest, the boreal forest, and the shorelines. And that would include the shorelines of Maine, which are critically important for migrating shorebirds as overnight stops to feed up for their next leg of their journey after having bred further north. But the habitat that has lost the most, and lost the most throughout North America, are the grasslands. They have lost 53% of the total number of birds that were historically in the grasslands. This is a slightly different way of looking at this 50-year decline. You have a list of the different types of habitat, all of the habitat groups that they categorize birds into. And what the bar shows is, starting with this middle line where the 0 is, that's the bird population in 1970. So if you go to the left, you can see the decline, the magnitude of the decline in percent. And if you go to the right, you'll see the magnitude of increase in percent. And right away, it's apparent that there is only one habitat that has seen an increase in the number of birds residing in it, and that's the wetlands. Otherwise, every single habitat has lost. And again, here's the grassland, the big loser. That's the total number of birds, irrespective of species. So we can also ask the question, well, okay, I mean, maybe there are only a small percentage of species that are losing tons of birds. And so it really isn't a problem for all birds. It's mostly a problem just for a few species. So if we look at the proportion of species that are showing change, it's almost as bad. So here we are down here at the grasslands. 74% of the species that exist in the grasslands are showing a decline. In second place are the forests. The western forest and the eastern forest both show a 64% drop. That's 2/3 of the species are seeing a decline in population. And once again, the only habitat, showing an increase in species is the wetlands, where 47% of the species have shown an increase. So we have a pretty dismal picture here. It's a pretty consistent picture, and it asks us now to look a little bit deeper into, well, which birds are the birds that we're losing? This pie chart here looks at the 50-year decline across almost all of the groups of songbirds. And you can see it's not even. There are 10 groups of birds, groups of songbirds, that account for 90% of the birds that have been lost. And overwhelmingly, look at it, the American sparrows. This is why the white-throated sparrow was on that earlier graph. It belongs in this group. And the American sparrows, the wood warblers, and the blackbirds are the three native groups that show more than half of the loss. That's what, about 2/3. And then the fourth group that shows a large loss are the Old World sparrows, which is the one you're probably most familiar with, is the house sparrow. There have been some groups that have shown gains, even in the songbirds. So vireos and gnatcatchers have shown increases. And otherwise, it's been raptors and the turkeys and the ducks and geese have shown increases. But look at the number there. We've gained among these groups 250 million birds. But then when you look at the number on the red pie chart, it's 3.2 billion birds that we've lost. And I did a little bit of math, and that means we've lost 13 times more birds than we've gained. So it's a losing proposition. And birds are not necessarily alone in this. This kind of decline is happening in other groups of animals as well. And as part of, as we'll see some detail later, probably part of what is now being called the sixth mass extinction, which is pretty much totally caused by human activities. Here are the 5 families that have suffered the most: the New World sparrows, the warblers, the blackbirds, and the Old World sparrows and the larks. And you can get some, I mean, the numbers are just staggering if you look at them. They haven't lost the same proportion all the way through. The sparrows haven't lost, for example, they've retained, I should say, more than 50% of their 1970 number. But if you look at the Old World sparrows, the dark little dots here are the ones that are left. And these are the ghosts of those that are no longer with us. Same with the larks. They've lost large proportions of their populations. And here are the ones that have gained. The raptors and the turkeys have gained about 200% in terms of numbers, and the waterfowl about 50%. And let's get a little up close and personal and look at some specific examples. So as you look around this graph, notice the birds that you're familiar with. So if you look at sparrows, for example, down here, song sparrows, we've lost 20% of our song sparrows, 40% of the savanna sparrows, 40% of the eastern towhees. And they actually haven't fared that badly. So the losses in the sparrows are pretty well spread out across the species. If, on the other hand, you look at the warblers over here, the Canada warbler has lost 60% of its numbers. And that 60% loss is matched by the lark family and by the horned lark, I should say, and by the bobolink, which is part of the blackbird family. Each of those 3 species has lost 60%, has declined to only 40% of the numbers that were present in 1970. But the one that has lost the most is a member of the finch family, and that's the evening grosbeak. Since 1970, the population size of evening grosbeaks in North America has dropped by 90%. So only 10% of the numbers remain today that we saw back in 1970. And I'm going to pause here to see if there are questions, any questions about the this general overview, this big overview, because we're going to shift and start to move down a little closer to Maine in the next section.
So Barbara, there are a couple of questions about wetlands. One is why are the numbers of birds in wetlands increasing? And sort of in a parallel question is, how is it that wetland birds are increasing when we hear all the time about how wetland, the acreage of wetlands is decreasing?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. And there are going to be some areas of the country where the wetlands and the population of birds are declining. I'm sort of hinting at what we'll touch back on a little bit later, but one of the main reasons we see an increase in wetlands birds is because of the incredible efforts to preserve habitat and the bird species throughout their flyway, in the breeding area, and in their wintering area, because there is a large number of people that love to go out and hunt ducks. So Ducks Unlimited has been a huge conservation partner in preserving habitats for ducks. So that's one of the reasons why the ducks and geese in particular, which is most of the birds in the wetlands, have increased. And of course, if you're preserving the wetlands for the ducks and geese, the other birds that are in the edges and sit on top of the reeds and so forth, those are also going to thrive in those areas. The problem with the threatened wetlands are two. There's development, but development tends to be fairly concentrated. So there are large areas of the freshwater wetlands, for example, that maybe aren't being encroached on by development. But then along the shore, there's the problem of sea level rise and the potential for the loss of the coastal marshes if there's no place for the water to go a little further inland and recreate the marsh, or what they call marsh migration, as you go further in. So the difficulty with the Mount Everest height view is that depending on the area you are, the particular species, the particular habitat, there are different things happening in different areas. So we're looking at the broad general, and that doesn't mean that we should be ignoring wetlands just because it appears to be the only area where there's an increase, because there are threats on the horizon, and there are threats locally in particular with regard to development. So hopefully that answers that question. And it gives you a preview of where.
One more question. The chart of the 50-year decline shows the decline leveling off. Do scientists believe that the loss is indeed leveling off?
You know, that's hard because the level off was 3 years ago, and they'll continue to collect data. I think and we'll talk again about this, we'll come back to it later. One of the pieces of the puzzle is what's going to happen to climate change. If we continue on the path that we're going right now with climate change, no, it's not going to level off. It's not. And if our population continues to increase the way it is, that's also going to have a major impact. And we can maybe touch on a little bit of some of those impacts and why they're so important later on when I get to the impact section.
All right, that's it for questions.
Okay, so we'll go. All right. So here are the major threats to bird diversity. And again, remember these threats, some threats are going to be more important in some regions of North America, and other threats are going to be important in others. But these are the 8 major threats that have been identified by this group that is studying bird population change. There are threats in all areas of a range that a bird will occupy. So it can be, the threat can be one on the breeding ground and something different during migration, and yet a third problem on the wintering grounds. But these are the major threats that the birds face. And almost all of them are going to be exacerbated by climate change. The 3 at the top, sea level rise, urbanization, and cropland expansion, all result in habitat loss. And if you lose habitat, the birds have no place to be, to feed, to rear young, and so forth. The ones that are most threatening here in Maine and elsewhere as well are the extreme spring heat that comes unexpectedly, and often when young are in the nest, they're very vulnerable to that. And then what they call fire weather, because fire weather not only is that hot and dry, which has implications for the birds themselves, but if in fact you get a fire, now you're wiping out whole habitats that were originally able to be used by the birds. Among these 8, there are 2 that we don't see very often, or if at all, in Maine. These are mostly spring drought and false springs, which means an early spring followed by a frost. These we usually see in the bottom half of the United States. So let's look at species vulnerability a little differently. And it looks like I typoed and didn't get the I back in species vulnerability in general, but this is echoed also in Maine. And what we want to look at is, first of all, the overall pattern, and then what other factors might be contributing to the decline in birds. So what you have up here, this is kind of the key to the whole chart, is the point in 1970 where we start out with 100% of our birds. And the bars are going to show you the current estimate for how much change has happened. So the estimate of where we think the population is right now is represented by the black bar, and then everything in blue to its left is representing the population that currently exists. And again, as you can see, the only place where we see an increase of any magnitude is in the waterfowl with the ducks. There is also a slight increase in native resident species overall. So this is counting everything, including ducks. But we can see that the introduced species, these are like our old world sparrows, don't do very well, perhaps because they're out of their normal range, and that everything else tends to be hanging around a 70% or so decline in, a 70% remainder, a 30% decline from the 1970 100% total. And there are other factors besides climate change that may be contributing here. So I already mentioned that introduced species might have some trouble adapting. There are some people who've said that the house sparrow may be declining because its heyday was back when there were plenty of horses everywhere with droppings that they were able to exploit to pick up seeds and other things. Native migratory species may be having problems in their winter location. Native resident species and land birds may be subject in some areas to habitat loss. For example, the red-breasted nuthatch is vulnerable to losses of coniferous forest territory, which is something that would happen in an area, for example, that's heavily logged or is cleared for farming. Shorebirds, again, habitat loss here may be huge, especially for migrating shorebirds who depend on those spots to stop for a day or two to feed up. If there's heavy development, or if the sea level rises and wipes it out, that area is lost to the shorebird. And these are traditional. So the shorebirds learn them in their first year of migration and come back to the same one over and over and over again. And if it disappears, some of them will find alternatives, but there's no automatic alternative for them. And this is a problem not only for birds going south in the winter, but also coming north in the spring. Coming north in the spring. Get my directions turned around here. Water birds like herons are also subject to habitat loss. That was especially the marsh migration is another problem for them. And insect feeders like the barn swallow are suffering from a potential loss of food supply. There has been a huge loss in some areas of the world in the insect population. In some areas, it's bad enough that they call it insect Armageddon. And that really could be impacting all insectivorous birds. And then finally, here we have our waterfowl with an increase, probably due to the extensive habitat preservation that I mentioned before. But there are more intimate threats to bird diversity. Those of you who have cats, please keep them inside. Every year, cats are estimated to kill 2.6 billion birds out of a total loss due to human activities of about 3.5 billion each year. Windows, 624 million, vehicles, 214 million, and industrial collisions, which means going into tall buildings or windmills, about 64 million. But overwhelmingly, the culprit here that humans have a lot of control over is cats, 2.6 billion each year. Now we're going to home in a little bit on Maine. Again, the data sometimes just doesn't allow for definitive statements. But where I got the source of my graphs and information is in two primary places. The Audubon website that looks at the effects of climate has the ability to go state by state. So you can go and find out what this condition is in Maine. You can even put in a zip code and find out what the situation is there as far as they know. The second one is a book that was published just this past November called Birds of Maine, published by Peter Vickery. And this was an update of two previous books, one done, I can't remember when, early 1900s, and the other one was done in 1949. And there had not been a comprehensive review of the condition or the status of birds in Maine since 1949. And Peter Vickery set about to do that. He unfortunately passed away before the book was finished, but his wife and the co-authors and editor and illustrators have finished it. If you are a birder in Maine and want to really know what's going on in Maine, I would highly recommend you getting it. It's hard to get a hardback copy, at least through Amazon it was, and they're quite expensive, but you can get one on Kindle. So if you're a big birder, I would encourage you to check this out. Climate change in Maine is going to be one of the major driving factors in the change in bird life going forward. These two graphs are a comparison of what it has looked like for the last about 20, 25 years and what it may look like by the time we reach the middle of this century. We are going to be a lot hotter here on the coast, and we are going to lose most of our nice, cool regions that right now exist in the northern part of Maine. Now, this is mean annual temperature. So this is not just summer. This takes into account the fact that our winters are also going to be warmer. So what is the impact of this? It can take multiple forms. Very acutely, if you have spikes in temperature or changes in rainfall, this can affect the growth of plants. It can affect the amount of seed set. It can also affect how well insects grow and survive. And how well that all happens is going to impact the animals that rely on them for food, and in particular, in the case of birds, for rearing their young. And a temperature spike in the late spring, early summer is going to be particularly problematic for the young because they are very vulnerable to heat exhaustion. They don't regulate temperature real well at that young age. And if this goes on for a long enough period of time, we're going to start to see some chronic impacts. We're going to see shifts in the season. If it starts to warm in Maine earlier and consistently warms earlier, our spring is going to be earlier. The insects and plants are going to grow earlier. And if migrating birds arrive too late, they won't be able to exploit the maximum food supply. And that's going to impact how many young they can rear. And in addition, critical foods may now not thrive, they may disappear, and this is going to have an even more serious impact on the ability of birds to remain in the area. So to show one example, projected example of what might happen as climate shifts, we're going to look at the wood thrush, which does occur here in Maine. Its current range is in this very sort of pale beige color. It's basically the eastern half of the United States minus Florida. And what we're going to look at in the next little vignettes of the map is where they might be seeing range gain, which will be in blue, where it's improving, which will be in the greens, and where it's worsening, which are going to be in the reds. So if we increase temperature by 1.5 degrees, which is the limit that the Paris Accord would like us to stop at, and we are already at 1 degree, the thrush will lose a little bit of its habitat, but not much. If we gain 2 degrees, it's going to lose more. And the range, you notice, is starting to shift north. So we've got range gain into southern Canada and improving in even further south in Canada and a little bit in the northernmost tip of Maine. If we go up by 3 degrees, we're going to lose what? That looks to me like about 2/3 of the current range is going to be lost to the wood thrush. And it's going to be basically a southern Canada, northernmost, absolutely northernmost United States bird, and may in fact become lost to most of Maine. There are other shifts. Now, this is one that I in particular actually kind of like. I don't know how many of the rest of you really enjoy seeing the bright red of the cardinal, but it's not in its original range. Its original range was the southeastern US. It migrated, moved up to the Great Lakes by 1895, and then spread east. Connecticut in 1943, Massachusetts in 1958, and the first recorded breeding pair in Maine was in 1969. And you can see by looking at the portion of the graph that relates to Maine up here that its range is definitely spreading throughout Maine, whereas back in 1990, it was limited and was found only in the coastal area at the very south. Evening grosbeak is on the other side of the coin, the losing side of the coin. You recall I mentioned that it had lost 90% of its population size since 1970. And you can see here how the range has shifted. Very rare to see it anymore in our neck of the woods. But it was a bird that actually was pretty rare in the eastern United States up until the mid-1800s anyway, at which point it spread east, perhaps following a food supply. And it's been declining ever since the 1970s and 80s, perhaps linked to a reduction in boreal forest and the reduction in the insects that would have been found there. Sea level rise is very important in Maine. The Bay of Fundy is one of the areas where the water is warming and rising in level faster than almost any other area in the world. And that is going to impact our marshland birds. If those nice coastal marshes become inundated with ocean waters, there has to be a way for those waters to create new marshes inland, or we're going to lose these birds because they rely on this particular ecosystem. The response, and this is something that land trusts especially those along the coast, are focusing on is to protect land adjacent to marshes that can become new marsh as sea level rises. So multiple threats to birds and people that are coincident with shifts in climate. In Maine, our three biggest threats are spring heat waves, fire weather, heavy rain, and sea level rise for a few species. But if you're looking at number of species impacted, it's these three that are in the red box. So if we look at Maine now and ask, well, how many threats at one time, at any one time, is a bird species going to need to face in Maine? You can see that with a 1.5 degree centigrade rise in temperature, most of Maine is going to be faced with 2 to 3 threats at the same time. So it could be spring heat waves, but then you'll get periods of heavy rain, or you might have some urbanization, especially in some of the areas. I think this is about around where Bangor is, maybe, if I'm remembering correctly, and then down here. And the threats get only worse if the warming goes up to a level of an additional 3 degrees centigrade. So we're now seeing areas where birds are facing 4 to 5 threats at the same time. And the more threats you add to a bird's ability to survive, the less likely it's going to be able to make it. If the adults survive, they may not be able to bring off young. And for many of these birds, especially the songbirds, their lifespan is not that long. It's measured in less than 10 years, rather than some of the longer years we're associated to thinking about with maybe some of our larger mammals. If we look close to home, this is the Brunswick area. We're looking at not too many threats right now, with a 1.5 degree sea rise. Perhaps sea level is going to be a problem in some of the areas because of the lack of marsh migration, which they actually aren't showing here, probably because of lack of data. That's with 1.5 degrees. If we go 3 degrees centigrade, you can see that the number of threats rises, as is the case for the rest of Maine. So we are seeing some of these same threats that the other more rural areas of Maine have, and we could add in our immediate area the threat of urbanization as well, general development. So what are the species that we are currently looking at as being the most vulnerable? So right now, with a 1.5 degree temperature rise, we estimate that 3 species have a high vulnerability for disappearing: the spruce grouse, the least tern, and the black-throated green warbler. And I don't know about you, but that zee-zee-zoo-zee that you hear in the spring is one that I've gotten very used to hearing and quite fond of, so be ashamed to lose it. If we go to a 2 degree rise, there are 9 species that now are threatened. So we add the razorbill, the boreal chickadee, the brown thrasher, the eastern towhee, Cape May warbler, bay-breasted warbler, palm warbler. With a 3 degree rise, 48 species are now threatened with not being able to remain viable here in Maine. And I'm not going to go through all 48, but there are a large number there that you would be quite familiar with. To look at the impact on one group of summer birds, I picked the warblers. I remember 25 years ago when we first had our cottage in Steuben, I would sit on the back deck and I could see on any one day, I'd see 4, 5, 6 different warbler species flitting in and around the trees right in front of the deck. I see the black-throated green now, and that is it. The others I'll see occasionally when I'm out hiking, but the numbers are just not there in the way that they were 25 years ago. So if you look at this chart, everything that's in red is showing a potential for becoming completely absent from Maine. The paler orange are worsening. Those in blue are improving. So there are a few warblers who are benefiting from it, perhaps because their normal range is a little further south. But we have a vast number of warblers who over a large part of their range in Maine are facing the possibility of not being around much longer. And I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions.
There are a couple of questions. Let's see. So one is, since wetlands are a relatively or a relative bright spot, what is happening with the population of wading birds?
I don't have that data in specific. The numbers are going down, and to a large extent, that's because of the decrease in habitat for their stopover spots during migration. I don't know whether any of you have read about now I'm blanking on the species. They always stop in the Chesapeake and the red knot. They stop in the Chesapeake. And the Chesapeake, because of the increase in development, but also in sea level rise, they're losing a lot of the area where they used to stop to feed. And this is going to have a follow-on effect further north where the red knots breed. And then as they migrate, the few that are left, as they come back south, whether or not we see numbers on the stopover spots along our shore. So it's spotty. It depends on the species. The upland plover, for example, has decreased in number quite substantially because its upland habitat has been lost, not due to sea level rise, but more to development. And there are others, if you look at individual species where you're seeing losses. But I actually do not know enough more detail to give you any clearer answer than that.
Next question is sort of about the role that birds play in the food chain. So besides the question is, besides the enjoyment we get from seeing these birds in nature, what implications do their losses have for agriculture and the food chain in general?
They spread seeds, is I guess what I would say is the major impact, for example, for agriculture or for plants. Let's not do agriculture, let's do plants in general. They're a great seed spreader. And it's a way that plants can replenish their numbers or extend their range. Otherwise, birds are not the big pollinators that insects are. So we don't see their loss affecting pollination that much. They also, however, are prey for some animals and many other birds. Think owls and some of our hawks. And as the bird numbers decline, that's going to diminish the amount of prey or the density of prey available for those birds. So I guess that in general.
And Molly wants to know why 1970 is the baseline. Is that just because someone did a lot of work or research around that time, or how did
I don't remember the exact reason, but that is a time when a large amount of data had been aggregated and was available, so that the groups that were working together could fairly reliably, like I said, we're looking from the top of Mount Everest, bring this data together and aggregated in a way that they can begin to see some trends. Before that, it's a little spottier.
Okay. What happens in a species that mates for life, like the cardinal, when a spouse dies? Do they remate, or is that another small factor in changes in population of the species?
That's going to depend on the species. There are species that mate for life, that when a mate dies, will pick up a new one. And then there are the stories about the bird that comes back, his mate doesn't come back, and it mopes around for the entire season and doesn't breed. There is no yes or no as to whether or not they'll remate. They may mate and it may not be successful also, depending on who they mate with, because a bird that mates with the same mate year after year after year is going to stay with that mate if the reproductive success is good. If it's not good, they might leave. And a bird is going to be quite choosy picking up a new mate if the reproductive success is a little dicey. So it's as with humans that may not mate for life. It depends, A, on the species, and B, on the individuals.
And this is the last question. Mary says, I realize this isn't just about birds, but perhaps you can explain how we have more sea level rise along one part of the East Coast, but not down south.
Oh boy, now you're getting into geology and hydrology, and I'm not sure I can do justice to this, but I do know that the Bay of Fundy, two things about it. One is that it has it's enclosed, so that when water gets up in there, it doesn't flow through. So when it gets in there, if warmer water gets in, it's going to stay there for a while. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other is that as water warms, if it's real cold, its density changes, and it actually takes up a little bit more space. Water takes up the least space at 4 degrees centigrade, which is 45 degrees maybe Fahrenheit, somewhere in there. So if you warm up above that, the water is going to be there, it's going to take up more room. So right there, as you begin to warm, it's going to rise a little because of that. We also have the Arctic melt. And as the waters come down out of the Arctic, some of them are getting up into the Bay of Fundy. And again, it's an enclosed area, so it's going to hang out there for a little bit longer. So those are kind of in general, and I may, if there are geologists in the group or hydrologists, I probably butchered it. But in general, as I understand it, that's pretty much why the Bay of Fundy is having more of a problem with temperature and water height increase than almost any other area of the world.
All right, so that's it for questions now. So carry on.
Okay. Well, let's go back to sharing. And what we're going to do now is to kind of look at things that can help, excuse me, things that can help and steps forward. It's a big problem. So unfortunately, it's going to take big solutions and multiple solutions. One of the things that helped early on for some groups of birds was the Endangered Species Act. And the bald eagle here is kind of the poster child, and got a lot of people excited about passing laws against killing them, about instituting breeding programs, habitat protection, and reintroduction of birds that had suffered a decline. And the raptors are the group that has benefited overwhelmingly from this, but other groups have benefited as well. The other thing that has really helped is habitat conservation. And this is breeding habitat, wintering habitat, and migration habitat. And if you look at the millions of acres that have been preserved in Maine, I should have labeled this as Maine. This graph is a Maine graph from 1900 up to 2017. You can see that right around 1990, it took a huge leap. And it's interesting what caused that leap. From the early 1900s, this looks to be about 1915, up until 1990, the majority of the land going into conservation was going there because of public efforts. So these are public lands. These are state parks and federal parks. And that's kind of leveled off. But starting around 1990, the number of acres that went into conservation due to private easements, so these are easements that protected land from development, or NGOs, which are your land trusts, began to increase. So that now when you add these three up, we have a total amount preserved that is has shown a quite dramatic increase. But it's still only 4 million acres. And we know that there are vast areas of Maine that are not under habitat conservation that are vulnerable. So the question that remains is, what can you, yourself sitting out there in the Zoom audience, what can you do? And we're going to look at several of these. First of all, I urge you to support climate policy in Maine, and that is a shifting ground. They were talking about wind, offshore wind earlier today, but the goals that Mills and her government have set are pretty dramatic, and it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take some compromises. One of the organizations that is actively involved in promoting some of these solutions is the Citizens Climate Lobby. And one of their big projects is to try to get legislation for carbon pricing, so that people who use more carbon end up paying more for that, to hopefully help drive it down, but also provide some funding that can help support some of the alternatives for renewables. This cartoon hits our next two. So the dog from Other Coast is watching a television report about how bad glass-covered office towers are as deadly obstacles for birds, and that millions of birds die when they fly into these skyscrapers and into windows in general. If you'll recall, it was 624 million birds each year. And these little bluebirds are telling him, well, we'd walk, but the city is full of cats. So this points to the two areas where each individual can do something to help preserve birds. First of all, do something about the windows, especially if you have big picture windows that are near areas where there's a bird feeder or plants that birds love to sit in or feed in. Decals on the window, or anything that will break up the reflection, that makes it look like a path into the woods to the birds. People also put nets on their windows, suspended out. Maybe you have a little bit of an overhang. If you suspend it out about 6 inches from the window, the bird will fly into the net and bounce off. So these are two ways that you can help cut down on the loss of birds there. And then, of course, keeping cats indoors, and we've already talked about that. Fourth, reduce plastic use. This is a problem for two reasons. First of all, the plastic itself for some birds, especially those that forage in water, can cause problems. You think of those rings that are around the 6-packs of beer and soda. A bird can get caught in those. And if, depending on where and how that plastic is caught, may not be able to resurface. This is a problem in particular for diving birds. But more than that, plastic as it degrades becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and can get brought into the food chain at the very lowest level and then move up the food chain as each level feeds on it. So the birds themselves may actually at times be ingesting plastics. Think of things like the leech's petrel that scoops up the crustaceans at the surface of the water. If those crustaceans have taken in little tiny, tiny microscopic plastic as part of their feeding, then the petrel is also going to get the plastic. Avoid pesticides, and I should say probably also herbicides as well. There can be a direct impact on birds, but they also can directly impact the food sources that the birds rely on. Insects in the case of pesticides, plants that produce seeds in the case of herbicides. Drink shade-grown coffee. This is protecting the wintering habitats of the birds that migrate down to Central and South America. A lot of the areas there have been clear-cut and coffee to be grown in ways that do not support the birds that winter there. But there are organizations that support farmers down there who use good practices in growing their coffee. So look for those and buy them if you can. And then finally, here in your backyards, reduce lawn. That reduces the amount of herbicide you might have to use, and plant native plants. These native plants are adapted to the local environment. They have a better chance of dealing with variations in the climate, and they're in the natural local food chain. So they'll be more supportive of the health of the birds that are there. And one thing you can do to grow on is citizen science. And there are all sorts of ways to do citizen science. I've mentioned Project Feeder Watch, which you can do from the comfort of your own home. It runs from mid-November to early April. And you can report. I don't know whether they have paper reports anymore. I do my reporting online. It's very easy to do. Maine Audubon has a community science program that you can get involved with. And so does the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. So depending on your interests, which may not be birds, maybe some other species, or it could be plants, check those organizations out. And if citizen science isn't your thing, support the organizations that do. And of course, stay informed. This came as a big surprise to people, the magnitude of the bird decline. So now people's awareness is raised and they're going to be looking to see what happens in the future. But there are other species and other habitats that don't get that kind of scrutiny, that keep your eyes open and see if those also may pique your interest and gather your support. And finally, I have to end with a poem. This is not my poem, but this is too close to what we've just talked about to miss. This was in the Maine Sunday Telegram back in September by Linda Aldrich, called Notes from a Library Lecture. And reading through this, I have to think she was at one of the lectures given by the Audubon Society here in Maine. How much does the songbird weigh? How much the song? The smallest hummingbird weighs less than a penny. Would we feel it light on our hand? Do we bother with pennies? A hummingbird takes 250 breaths a minute. Can the exhalation move a feather? 48 warblers weigh the 1 pound of coffee we drink in a week. To wake up. We wake up. Do we wake up? Our Earth is the tiniest blue eye, sleepless and unblinking. 3 billion birds are missing. Finches, sparrows, blackbirds, wrens, they weigh on us. Glaciers weigh less than the water melting from them. Our tears are heavier than ice. As far as we know, we are all we know. No one is coming to save us. And that's it.
That's a great poem.
Yes, I couldn't believe when I read it back in September. I mean, You know, she was obviously sitting in a lecture very like the one I heard that kicked off the whole 3 billion birds effort to get the word out, which the Audubon Society did. The Maine Audubon Society did. Gosh, when was it? Must have been 2019, because it was after that I did a version of this talk for the first time.
And I just want to say, you know, listening to all of the, you know, it's stark information at times, but I really think that it's important that we all just sort of don't get overwhelmed. You know, pick one thing you can do that thing, make it a habit, and then feel empowered to do the next thing. So you really have to break it down into pieces, and that's what's so great about what you've done, Barbara, is given sort of some discrete actions that people can do. And I will also say one thing that's coming up in April. We're putting together a panel of Bowdoin College students, several of whom have worked in Maine with local organizations. I think one worked for the town of Topsham, another for the town of Brunswick. And they've all done research that's related to climate action. And they're going to be doing a panel presentation on what they've been doing. And it's really exciting to hear what youth are doing. And we really wanted to sort of lift up their efforts as an inspiration to everyone that, you know, there are things you can do. And they're doing research on, you know, bike ped policy in Maine and how that relates to climate change. So that's coming in April. Anyway, so we do have a couple of questions, and folks who, you know, need to jump off the call, feel free to do that, and we'll just go through the remaining questions. Let's see, there's a question from Richard wanting to know what your view is on offshore wind power. And I assume he's asking that in relation to bird strikes and bird loss.
I'll be honest, I don't at this point have a firm opinion. I think that the problem, I don't know. I don't have an opinion. With all of these choices we're going to have to make, we're balancing two things. Everything humans do has an impact. And the question is, what can we do that will have the least impact? Nothing we do is going to have zero impact. Everything is going to have an impact. You build a dam, you get renewable energy, but what have you done? You've wiped out some habitats, you've wiped out some communities. So should we, you know, I would say, I think it's worth doing a pilot study. We also have a lot of information, which I actually haven't looked into, about the North Sea wind farms that they have. So I don't know what their experience has been in terms of loss of birds, interference with fishing, interference with migration of sea animals. I just don't know that. But I think having a pilot project is probably a good starter. And what Mills announced today is that pilot project will be in federal waters, which are beyond the immediate coastal area, which is an area that is heavily traveled by fishermen whose livelihood depends on being able to get to the beds where the lobster are, for example. So hopefully that will help balance a little bit to human concerns. And what the pilot will do, hopefully, is find out, well, what impacts are there on the other animals that we share the planet with and that go through that one particular region of the ocean. So we'll have to wait and see.
Diane has a comment. She says, I think this is in reference to both sort of windows and birds. She says, I've made my case as we are adding a story, and I assume that's a second story, and windows to our local library on the park that is a flyway for migrating birds. I wonder where that is. Not familiar with that. Mary says, if anyone wants info on planting natives, check out Wild Seed Project. They sell native Maine seeds. That's a great organization in Portland. You can, as she says, you can buy seeds. Their website is also a fantastic resource for any kind of, if you're interested in planting natives, they've got a ton of information about, you know, what to plant in what different types of conditions, whether it's, you know, dry and shallow or sandy or, you know, wet. It's a really good resource. And Maine Audubon every year has a plant sale, and they're selling all natives. So that's a great way to both support Maine Audubon and get some more natives. And I have to say, I've been planting more shrubs and pollinator flowers in my yard, and there's been a huge difference in the number of birds. So it really does make a difference.
And actually, let me say one thing too about the plants is, remember, a lot of birds eat insects, and the more native plants you plant, the more insects that are native are going to be able to be there. And, you know, again, the poster child is the milkweed and the monarch butterfly. But there are many, many other insects that utilize our native plants. And the more of them there are around, the more insects for the birds to eat. And almost all birds will eat insects to one degree or another, especially the small ones, while they're feeding their young, because it's a source of protein for the young that are growing so rapidly. So even if it's not an insectivore like a swallow, most birds are going to get some kind of insect for at least a short period of time while they're rearing their young.
There's a great, Doug Tallamy is an entomologist who's done a lot of work on insects and birds and the relationship between them. And Maine Audubon has a great video of his talk, which I think was in 2016 on their website. And he did a study of a native oak. He lives in Delaware, I think. And he went around and counted all of the caterpillars on his native oak in his yard at eye height. And he counted 400. And then he went to and did the same at his neighbor's non-native tree. And he counted 1. All the way, or same thing. So it's really, he thinks of native trees, many native trees, as giant bird feeders. So if you
and one other point to make about bird feeders, you don't forget to clean your bird feeder, because it can mold and all sorts of bacteria can fester in there if the seed starts to go bad, and then the birds can get it and they spread it. So don't forget to clean your bird feeder. And if you notice sick birds, take the bird feeder down, clean it, buy a new one, keep it down for a couple of weeks, a month, so that the bird that's sick doesn't reinfect the seed. It turns out that most birds are getting only about 20% of their energy from your bird feeders. They're still finding plenty out there in the wild. So you don't need to worry about them, or they'll go to your neighbor's bird feeder if push comes to shove.
Jacqueline says, also for native plants info and what not to plant, and I'm sure she's referring to invasive species. Check the plant list available from the UMaine Extension website. And the Maine Natural Areas program also has a really good information sheets on invasive plants. Diane is sending me a poem that she wrote. That's great. Poetry is, we need to use those, get those creative juices, put them to work to advance the cause. Let's see. Pat is asking if your slideshow can be put on our website. So you willing to share that, Barbara?
Yeah.
So if you send that to me, I'll get a post up on the news tab of our website, and we'll have a link to Barbara's presentation as well, and to her PowerPoint.
Do it as PowerPoint or a PDF?
PDF would be great. Lots of thanks from folks. Oh, so many thanks. Let's see. Lynn says, as a naturalist who talks about birds, I'm sometimes asked, birds are pretty, but why should I care about their welfare? This is one area where Audubon could do more. Good point. And Raul says, it sounds like reducing carbon to limit climate change is the most important action we can take to save birds as fast as we can. And I would definitely agree with that. Oh, the library that Diane was talking about is in New Jersey. How often should a bird feeder be cleaned? Mary wants to know.
At least once a month. And I have to admit that I'm sometimes negligent in doing that, but dump the seed out and rinse it with a solution of no more than 1 part Clorox to 9 parts water. That's the maximum strength you should use. Let it soak in that for a little while, rinse it out, let it dry. So, you have it down maybe for a couple of days while you do that, and then you can put it back up.
Great, well, that's it for the questions. And thank you so much, Barbara. That was just a fantastic amount of information. And we really love the fact that you left us on a positive note with what we can do. And I might suggest that the first thing that people can do is sign up to for our lunch and learn on zero waste, how to reduce your waste. Because a big part, I know that she's going to talk, among other things, about getting metal water bottles and stop buying, all the plastic water bottles that we generate in quantity. So anyway, so that's it for our show. Thanks so much, Barbara. This was really fantastic.
Oh, you're welcome.
Lots of kudos in the chat box.
It's my pleasure.
Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Right.